The Mexican migrant experienced the rise during the 1910s. So, starting off with the historical context, the Mexican Revolution started November 20th, 1910. Francisco Madero led a revolt against longtime President Porfirio Diaz, who had refused to resign and favored wealthy landowners and industrialists. Diaz had wanted to make Mexico into an industrial and modernized country, implementing capitalist society, which caused lower classes to suffer. And he had also distributed lands to wealthy non-nationals in order to strengthen ties with them. And this meant that Mexicans now needed a legal title to own land, and that had left small farmers hopeless. This image right here is a poster of Manuel Macias in 1912 to overthrow dictatorship of Diaz. Manuel Macias was a supporter of the revolt against Diaz. He was a good friend of Francisco Madero. The poster says Tierra y Libertad, Guerra Civil, Viva México, which translated into English means land and liberty, civil war, long live Mexico. And the Mexican Revolution was just primarily a populist revolt against a hugely unequal social structure. Leaders had divergent political and military goals and ambitions, fracturing a power and a descent into bloody civil war. Our artifact, La Obra de Una Mamá by Martina Morado Vallejo, is a memoir which records Martina's journey from Guanajuato, Mexico to Horton, Kansas, and later on to Des Moines, Iowa. So first is soon after we left Mexico, the War of 1911 started. I don't know what would have happened to me if I had not come with my mother when we did. Her family was suffering in Mexico because of the events leading up to the Mexican Revolution, such as financial instability and violence. Another thing that she had stated in her memoir was, even though I cannot speak English with patience, one can get through everything. This told us one of the challenges that she had faced, her and her mother, when she first arrived to the US. And it was the language barrier because they spoke Spanish and the US was majority English. The image here is of Angela Morado and Martina Morado. It's mother and daughter. And Angela was the one who decided to move her family to the US in order to keep them safe from the Revolutionary War that was going on in Mexico. In World War One, it was from 1914 to 1918, there was a labor shortage caused by going into the war. The war demanded greatly increased production of a wide range of goods, both agricultural and economic. In May 1917, a year before the war ended, the U.S. Department of Labor issued an order allowing farmers to bring Mexicans here, exempt from the usual head tax, literacy test, and other restrictions, as long as they performed agricultural work. Midwestern companies plus other U.S. companies responded to this issue by recruiting Mexicans. For example, to help meet the need for larger good production during World War One, owners of Bettendorf Company turned to migrants.
Martina's memoir touches on her experience living through World War I as a migrant. Quote, "Today I received a letter from Benita in which she tells me much. Asking about my health, tells me that she is fine, but a bit sad because she finds herself alone. I understand everything." End quote. Migrants settling in the US often felt lonely and afraid. Benita, a friend of Martina, shares that she is having a similar experience as she recently migrated to the US following World War I.
This image right here is of Marcelino Serna, Mexican American soldier during World War One. Private Marcelino Serna did not receive the Medal of Honor due to him being a Mexican American and an immigrant. So this showed the um, discrimination that Mexicans faced, even though they went there and they worked for them and took up work. They still faced racism and discrimination. During the Great Depression, there was declining wages, layoffs, unemployment. Companies cut payrolls and were going out of business. There was a food crisis and job shortage that had affected all workers. And the Great Depression had also brought hardships to Mexicans in Iowa as well as other parts of the Midwest. and it had also brought on racism and hostility towards them. The U.S. had created a system, Mexican Repatriation Act, that forced the deportation of between 400,000 and a million Mexicans.
In her memoir, Martina states, I felt so alone at times. After all the children were asleep at night, I would sit and cry for them, thinking about what the future would hold for them. End quote. The uncertainty the Great Depression brought caused many migrants to live in fear of losing their jobs. Many experienced cut wages by 50%, while others were fired in order to keep company costs as low as possible. Martina recounts the loneliness and uncertainty that she felt.
These two images are pictures from the Great Depression. The first one with the big group in a car is a Mexican migrant family during the Great Depression. Their car had broken down and their tires popped and they were fixing it. The next image is two Mexican workers during the Great Depression. World War II had a manpower shortage and they had used up all their sources during the war. So all females and males of all ages worked 24/7, day and night. And because of the manpower shortage, the United States had turned to Mexico as a supplier for labor workers. And an agreement was made between both governments from the US and Mexico, which allowed Mexican citizens to take a temporary agriculture work in the US. This was known as the Bracero program, which became a solution to America's labor needs. And the program had managed migration, and because of this, more than 4.5 million Mexican citizens were legally hired to work in the United States.
Martina made her own family in the US and watched her kids grow up during various historical events. Quote, my son James was in the 8th grade when he left to go to work in a shoe shop. He was only 14 years old. I wanted him to continue school, but to no avail. Both he and Salvador left school early to go to work in order to help the family. I couldn't help but feel sorry to see them working so young. I tried to keep busy in order to occupy my mind so as not to think about our poverty, and in the little I could provide for all my children. End quote. Although the US provided Mexican migrants with education opportunities, it was very difficult and unrealistic for them to go to school due to financial instability. Many kids had to leave school to work and help provide for their family, even in the US. Martina recounts when her son left her. Quote, my son went into the service of the army at age 21 and returned to us in December 1945, end quote. Fortunately, her son came back alive to her after World War II ended in 1945.
This image right here are Mexican immigrants who were hired to work in California agriculture labor topping sugar beets.
In this graph, we can see the number of Mexican immigrants from the start of the Revolutionary War up until World War II. From the year 1900 to 1910, the number of immigrants doubled due to the Revolutionary War and World War I. In 1920, the same trend is seen, a double amount of immigrants. In 1930, immigration slowed down, however, was still rising. In 1940, immigration decreased due to the Great Depression and the scarcity of jobs it brought.
Angela Morado and her daughter Martina Morado migrated to the U.S. after facing social and economic instability in their home, Guanajuato, Mexico, just before the Mexican Revolutionary War erupted. Quote, imagine the sacrifice that I made in the state that I found myself in, lonely and in this strange place. I started writing these words. Martina wrote this in her memoir to provide her future kids an insight of the sacrifice she made with her mother by going into an unknown country.
This map on the right was created by Manuel Gamino, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, based on data he got from the 1920 census. The map shows the geographical distribution of Mexican immigrations, specifically seen in California, Texas, and the Midwest. The economic inequality, violence, and undemocratic government faced by Mexicans in their home country caused them to migrate to the Midwestern US. Martina, at 13, arrived in Horton, Kansas in 1910. Quote, "We settled in Kansas, a place mother didn't like much. We lived with my mother's relatives, and she worked to support me and my brother. We ran a rooming house and did laundry for people. As time passed, we got used to living in this place that we found so cold." End quote. This quote highlights that their migration stems from necessity and survival. Mexicans face cultural adjustments, including a new language, lifestyle, and social norms. Navigating through a new country with little to no family caused isolation and a loneliness in many. Additionally, discrimination, prejudice, legal stressors, family separation, and educational challenges unfolded upon Mexican migrants. And although their job opportunities in the US increased and living conditions improved compared to Mexico, the psychological impact on Mexican migrants is a multifaceted one.
George T. Edson was a reporter for the U.S. Department of Labor who visited Iowa in the 1920s. When he saw what was happening there, he had comments on it by saying they constitute a little colony unto themselves, and their presence is not heard of to the outside world. They are kept together in a remarkable manner, sometimes suffering poverty from long periods of unemployment, but sticking loyally to their location. This showed us that Americans were witnessing this, and they saw the change that Mexican migrants had on the U.S. and they noticed their big sense of community and solidarity. And Julio Vallejo, Martina's husband, went away to Iowa, leaving his family in Kansas to work in a railroad. And this image right here is the Mexican railroad workers in Iowa, 1920.
The Great Depression brought hardships and obstacles to new Mexican migrants and, as well, long-term Mexican residents. Discrimination, segregation, deportation, unemployment, and exploitation were all common during the turbulent years. Julio Vallejo was laid off from his railroad job due to the Great Depression. Quote, "After many setbacks, the family had to work in the beet fields of Minnesota. In May 1939, we left in a trap-covered truck. The trip was very tiring because of the heavy rain that fell most of the way. There were 12 of us, so you see it wasn't easy." End quote. After slowly adapting to Kansas, the Great Depression caused Martina's family to move to Minnesota, where they would find work in the beet fields. At this time, Martina's family had grown to include her 12 kids. The image on the right shows Martina's daughters in Minnesota in 1945. The Great Depression developed and further strengthened resilient communities, creating solidarity among migrants and a sense of identity. These new close-knit communities provided support and belonging. Quote, "All of us have to go through this valley of tears, and with God's love, we will be compensated." End quote. Martina Morado's memoir was written in Spanish by her, and her daughter, Florence Terrones, translated it into English. Florence wanted to translate her mother's memoir in order for her story to reach a broader audience. The quote highlights Martina's positive outlook on her journey. She acknowledges the difficulties that she faced, but reassures herself with God's love and stays hopeful for the future. Thank you.